I'm writing this anonymously because I don't recognize my own life anymore, and I don't trust myself not to make things worse if anyone who knows me sees this. I keep thinking that if I put the story down in the order it actually happened, maybe it'll stop looping in my head long enough for me to breathe. My wife and I have been married 9 years, together for almost 13. We're both in our late 30s. No kids yet, mostly by choice, partly because life kept feeling like it was about to slow down, but never actually did. We live in a small house we bought 5 years ago, nothing fancy, but we fixed it up together, painted every room ourselves, argued over tile samples and light fixtures, and somehow always ended up compromising in a way that felt fair. Our life wasn't flashy, but it was solid. Weeknight dinners that rotated between 3 dependable recipes. Saturday mornings with coffee at the same place down the street where the barista knows our order. Watching shows we both half-liked just because it was something to do together after long work days. The kind of marriage that doesn't give people much to gossip about. We also work at the same company. Different departments, different floors, different reporting lines. I'd been there longer. I was the one who referred her when a position opened up years ago. At the time, it felt like a win for both of us. Same commute, similar schedules, a built-in understanding of each other's stress. It never felt risky. If anything, it felt practical. My boss is a guy I've worked under for about 4 years. Smart, charismatic in that effortless way, the kind of person people gravitate toward in meetings. He's married, too. Talks about his wife enough that you remember her name. I trusted him. Not blindly, but in the way you trust someone whose professional life is entangled with yours. At first, there was nothing, or at least nothing I noticed. My wife has always been independent, and her job can be demanding. Late meetings weren't new. Occasional work drinks weren't new. She's always had her own rhythms, her own way of moving through the world, and I never felt the need to monitor or question that. Trust was just there. It was the air we breathed. The first shift was so small I almost feel embarrassed admitting it bothered me. She started staying late more often, but not consistently. It wasn't every night. It was unpredictable. She'd text saying a meeting ran long, or that something came up last minute. Sometimes she sounded energized when she got home, talking fast, replaying conversations from the day. Other nights she'd barely speak, just say she was exhausted and head straight to the shower. I told myself it was work pressure. Promotions were on the table. Deadlines were tight. That's what adults do. They get busy. Then there were the changes that didn't quite fit that explanation. She started putting more thought into how she dressed for work. Not inappropriate, not drastic, just intentional. Clothes that used to be reserved for dinners out. A new perfume. Hair done on days she used to throw it up and go. When I noticed and said something light-hearted about it, she smiled in a way that felt slightly off, like she'd been caught thinking about something else. My boss started acting differently around me too, though I didn't connect it at first. He became more careful, more formal, compliments that felt rehearsed. He'd cut conversations short. There were moments in meetings when I'd catch him looking at his phone and smiling, then quickly locking the screen when he realized I was there. I chalked it up to stress, or maybe his own stuff at home. The unease crept in slowly, like a low-grade fever you ignore because everything else seems functional. I remember lying in bed one night while my wife slept beside me, staring at the ceiling, feeling this pressure in my chest that didn't have a name yet. I couldn't point to a single thing and say, "That's it." There was just a growing sense that I was slightly out of sync with my own life, like I'd missed a step somewhere and didn't know when or how. I didn't snoop. I didn't check her phone. I didn't follow her or interrogate her. I kept telling myself that trust means choosing not to go looking for ghosts. The day everything broke wasn't dramatic in the way you'd expect. No planning. No suspicion guiding me there. I'd forgotten to drop off a set of documents my boss needed before the end of the day. Completely my fault. I realized it late, right as I was about to head home. I figured I'd just run upstairs, hand them off, say a quick goodbye, and be done with it. His office door was partially open when I got there. Lights on. I knocked once, lightly, already stepping forward. I saw them before my brain caught up. They were standing close. Too close for coworkers. My wife's hand was resting against his chest like it belonged there. His head was tilted down toward her. There was a softness in their posture that didn't belong to anything professional. Then they kissed. Not a quick mistake. Not something you could explain away as confusion or bad timing. It was familiar. Easy. The kind of kiss that assumes privacy because it's already happened before. I don't remember the sound I made, if any. I don't remember what I said. I remember the room feeling smaller than it should have been, like the walls had leaned in. I remember my boss stepping back, face drained of color. I remember my wife's expression shifting through shock, fear, and something else I couldn't name fast enough. And then I left. I walked out of that office, down the hallway, into the elevator, and out of the building without really understanding how my legs were moving. I sat in my car with the engine off, hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead, waiting for the world to snap back into the shape I recognized. It didn't. By the time I drove home, I already knew this wasn't a moment I could undo, no matter what explanations came next. Whatever I thought my life was built on had cracked open, and I had no idea yet how far the damage went. I just knew that when I walked through the front door, nothing would feel like mine anymore. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the dark, listening to my wife's breathing, every inhale and exhale feeling like an accusation. She had come home later than me, quietly, like she didn't want to wake me. I pretended to be asleep because I didn't trust my voice not to break if I spoke. At some point in the early morning, I replayed the moment in my boss's office again. Slower this time, like my mind was forcing me to really look at it. The way her hand rested flat against his chest, fingers splayed, not tense or hesitant. The way his shoulders softened toward her, like his body already knew what was allowed. The way neither of them flinched until I was fully in the room. That pause told me more than the kiss itself. People don't pause like that when they're doing something innocent. When the sun came up, I still hadn't decided what to do, so I did the easiest thing. I acted normal. Over breakfast, she asked if I wanted eggs. I said no. My voice sounded strange to me, like it belonged to someone else. She watched me a little too closely while she poured her coffee, like she was waiting for something. I wondered how long she'd been carrying this secret and how practiced she was at reading my face. I left for work early just to get out of the house. The office felt hostile in a way it never had before. Every hallway felt narrower. Every glass wall felt like it was hiding something behind it. I caught myself scanning faces, wondering who knew, who suspected, who might have seen something I hadn't. I hated that I was already shrinking inside my own workplace. My boss didn't come out of his office all morning. Around noon, he emailed me asking if we could talk when I had a moment. The phrasing alone made my stomach drop. Not now, not right away. When you have a moment. Like he was being considerate. Like he was still in control. I didn't respond. Instead, I went for a walk around the block, phone in my pocket, heart pounding, trying to think like a rational adult instead of someone whose life had just been ripped open. I kept asking myself what I actually knew versus what I was assuming. I had seen them kiss. I had seen familiarity. I hadn't seen sex. I hadn't seen texts. I hadn't seen how long it had been going on. But every attempt to minimize it collapsed under the weight of that image. Her leaning into him like that was where she was supposed to be. When I finally went home that evening, she was already there, sitting on the couch, waiting. She didn't try to ease into it. She didn't pretend nothing was wrong. She stood up the moment I walked in and said my name the way you say it when you already know the damage is done. I asked her how long. She hesitated. That hesitation hurt more than any answer could have. She said it started as conversations at work, then texts, then staying late together. She said it got out of hand. She said she never meant for me to find out like that. That last part landed wrong. I told her I didn't care how I found out. I cared that I did. I asked her if she loved him. She said no too quickly. I asked her if they'd slept together. She said no, and this time she cried when she said it. Big, shaking breaths, hands over her face. I watched from across the room, feeling detached, like I was observing a stranger. I couldn't tell if the tears were real or just the body reacting to consequences. She kept saying my name, kept apologizing, kept saying she'd never meant to hurt me. I didn't yell. That surprised both of us. Instead, I felt myself folding inward, like my brain was trying to protect me by numbing everything out. I thought about our house, our routines, the quiet life we'd built, and how fragile it suddenly seemed. I thought about my job, about sitting across from my boss in performance reviews, about pretending professionalism could survive something this personal. That night, I slept on the couch, not because I made a statement, but because the bedroom didn't feel like mine anymore. The next day at work, my boss cornered me in a conference room. He apologized again, said it was a mistake, said he never intended for it to cross that line, said he respected me. I almost laughed at that. Respect doesn't look like kissing my wife behind a half-closed door. I told him I needed space. I told him I didn't know what I was going to do yet. His relief was visible, and that made something cold settle in my chest. He was afraid of fallout, not of what he'd done. By the end of the week, I felt like I was living multiple lives at once. Husband deciding whether his marriage was salvageable. Employee wondering if his career had already been quietly compromised. Man questioning his own worth, his judgment, his ability to read the people closest to him. Every option felt wrong. If I confronted this fully, everything could explode. If I stayed silent, I felt complicit in my own humiliation. If I left my job, I lost years of work. If I stayed with my wife, I didn't know if I'd ever trust her again. And underneath all of it was a growing, terrifying realization. The life I thought I had might already be gone, and I was just the last one to understand that. I didn't expect help to come from anyone. If I'm being honest, I didn't think I deserved it. I had this growing belief that whatever happened next was just the bill coming due for being naive, for trusting too easily, for assuming that stability meant safety. The first crack in that belief came from someone I almost didn't answer the phone for. It was my older sister. She'd noticed something was off because I hadn't responded to her messages in days. Normally, I'd give her a vague excuse and move on. But when she asked, "Are you okay?" something in me finally broke loose. Not in a dramatic way. My voice just went flat like I was reading a report about someone else's life. I told her everything. I told her about the late nights, the unease, the moment in the office when I saw my wife and my boss kissing, the way the image kept replaying no matter how hard I tried to push it away. I told her how I felt trapped between my marriage and my job, like either choice meant losing something I couldn't replace. She didn't rush to fix it. That alone felt like a gift. She listened. Let me talk until I ran out of words. Then she said something I hadn't allowed myself to think yet. "You're acting like this is all happening to you, but you still get to choose what kind of man you are inside it." That stuck with me. Later that week, something else happened that shifted things again. I was staying late at the office, not because I had work to do, but because going home felt heavier than staying. I was in the break room when I overheard two coworkers talking quietly. Not gossiping loudly, not whispering conspiratorially, just talking the way people do when they think they're alone. One of them mentioned my boss's name, mentioned my wife's department. They didn't say anything explicit. They didn't have to. The pauses, the careful phrasing, the way they changed the subject when they noticed me. It told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a secret between three people anymore. The realization hit me hard. I hadn't just been betrayed in private. I'd been made into a quiet spectacle. A man walking around his workplace with a truth everyone else might already be circling, waiting to see how it ended. That night, I finally did something different. I asked my wife to sit down with me. Not to apologize, not to promise anything, but to answer questions. Real ones. I told her I needed honesty more than comfort. I asked how long it had been going on. She told me the timeline, and it was worse than I expected. Not because of explicit details, but because of duration. Weeks, months, enough time for routines to form, enough time for lies to become normal. I asked her what she felt for him. She didn't say love. She said escape. She said being around him made her feel seen in a way she hadn't realized she was missing. She said it didn't start with intention, but with attention. That word sat heavily between us. Then I asked the question I'd been avoiding since the moment I saw them kissing. "Did you think about me when you were with him?" She went quiet, long enough that the answer became obvious before she spoke. She said sometimes. She said she compartmentalized. She said she told herself it didn't change what we had at home. That was the moment something fundamental shifted inside me. I realized this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the story I'd been telling myself about our marriage, that it was built on mutual awareness, on choosing each other fully even when life got dull or hard. That story cracked right there. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I just felt very, very tired. The ally I found wasn't someone stepping in to save me. It was the clarity that came from finally seeing the situation without soft edges. My wife hadn't tripped into this by accident. My boss hadn't been careless. They had both made repeated choices, knowing exactly who those choices would hurt if discovered. And I had been the one cushioning the impact by hesitating. The price of that clarity was heavy. Once you see things clearly, you can't unsee them. You can't go back to wondering if you're overreacting or imagining things. The door closes quietly, but permanently. That night, lying alone again, I realized the biggest loss so far wasn't my marriage or my job. It was the version of myself who believed that being loyal and steady was enough to protect the life he loved. And once that belief died, I knew the next step, whatever it was, would cost me something real. The decision didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in moments when my body reacted before my mind could keep up. The first was at work. My boss asked if we could reset and move forward professionally. He said it carefully, like someone stepping around broken glass. He talked about discretion, about how things didn't need to become bigger than they already were. He framed it as maturity, as mutual protection. Something in me snapped. Not loudly, not explosively, but cleanly. I realized he was counting on my silence, counting on my fear of disruption, counting on the part of me that still wanted everything to go back to normal, even though normal no longer existed. He wasn't worried about me as a person. He was worried about containment. I told him I would not protect him from the consequences of his choices anymore. I didn't threaten him. I didn't raise my voice. I just said I was documenting everything, that I would no longer meet him alone, and that any communication going forward would be formal and transparent. The color drained from his face in a way I hadn't seen before. For the first time, the power imbalance shifted, even if only slightly. The second moment came at home. My wife had been trying, really trying, in the way people do when they're terrified of loss. Cooking dinners she knew I liked, asking about my day, leaving notes, promising therapy, promising transparency, promising patience, promising anything that might keep me from slipping further away. One night, she reached for me on the couch. Not sexually, just a hand on my arm, tentative, hopeful. I flinched. The look on her face when I pulled away will probably stay with me forever. Not because it made me feel guilty, but because it clarified something I'd been avoiding. The trust between us wasn't damaged. It was gone. And no amount of effort could rebuild it if my body itself no longer felt safe with her touch. That was when I finally said it out loud. "I don't know if I can stay married to you." She cried harder than I'd ever seen her cry. She asked if I was punishing her, if I was trying to make her suffer. I told her the truth, that I wasn't trying to do anything to her. I was trying to figure out how to live without disappearing inside myself. The third and final moment came late at night, alone. I sat at the kitchen table, documents spread out in front of me, emails, dates, notes I'd been quietly keeping, not out of revenge, but out of self-preservation. I saw, laid out plainly, how many times I had been the last consideration in decisions that directly affected my life. I thought about the man I'd been before all of this, the one who believed loyalty would always be met with loyalty, the one who assumed that if he did everything right, things wouldn't fall apart. That man was gone. In his place was someone who understood that boundaries are not ultimatums, and self-respect isn't cruelty. I didn't feel empowered, I felt terrified, but I also felt something steadier beneath the fear, a quiet resolve that I could not unknow what I now knew. The climax wasn't confrontation. It wasn't exposure. It wasn't shouting or revenge or dramatic exits. It was the moment I chose myself without knowing what that choice would cost. I went to bed that night aware that by morning, my life might look completely different, and that no one, not my wife, not my boss, not even the version of me that existed before, could make that decision for me anymore. Everything was balanced on a knife's edge. And for the first time since this began, I didn't step back from it. The day I finally admitted to myself that nothing was going to snap back into place was the day I stopped waiting for a moment of certainty. I had spent weeks, then months, expecting some internal signal, clarity, peace, anger sharp enough to guide me, love strong enough to override everything else. Instead, what I got was a slow, grinding awareness that, no matter what I chose, something essential had already been lost, and pretending otherwise was costing me more than the truth ever could. After I moved out, the first thing I noticed wasn't loneliness. It was quiet. Not the peaceful kind people talk about when they describe fresh starts, but the kind that makes you hyper-aware of your own thoughts. There was no one else's routine to orbit around, no subtle pressure to react a certain way, no need to manage anyone's emotions but my own. At first, that freedom felt like standing at the edge of something vast and empty. Then, gradually, it started to feel like room. I settled into a temporary rhythm at my sister's place. Morning coffee alone. Work. Long walks in the evening just to feel my body moving forward, step after step, when everything else felt stalled. I stopped checking my phone compulsively. I stopped rereading old messages. I stopped trying to reconstruct timelines in my head because I finally understood that knowing every detail wouldn't give me what I was actually looking for. It wouldn't make the betrayal smaller. It wouldn't restore the version of my marriage I missed. It would just keep me anchored to the moment I saw my wife and my boss kissing, like that image was the axis my entire identity now revolved around. My wife reached out often at first. Texts asking how I was doing, messages saying she understood if I needed space, followed by others saying she hoped we could talk soon. I didn't block her, I didn't ignore her entirely, but I answered when I had something real to say, not when silence made her anxious. That boundary felt cruel to her, I think, but it was the first one I set that was entirely for me. When we did talk, it was stripped of illusion. There were no dramatic apologies anymore, no promises that everything would be different if I just came home. Instead, there were long pauses, careful sentences, questions neither of us knew how to answer. She wanted to know what I needed. I wanted to know why it had been so easy for her to compartmentalize our marriage while she built something secret with someone else. Neither of us could give the other what they were asking for without lying. She told me once that she missed the way we used to be, and something in me recoiled at that phrasing. Not because I didn't miss it too, but because it assumed that version of us was still recoverable if we just wanted it badly enough. I told her, as gently as I could, that how we used to be existed in a context where I believed certain things about her and about us that were no longer true. That silence fell between us after that wasn't angry. It was resigned. Work continued, almost offensively indifferent to my internal collapse. Meetings still happened. Deadlines still mattered. Emails still needed responses. HR did what HR always does: contained the issue, smoothed the edges, minimized disruption. My boss was reassigned quietly. no public reckoning, no apology that meant anything. I realized then that justice, at least in the way we imagine it, is a luxury rarely afforded in situations like this. The world doesn't balance the scales just because you were wronged. What surprised me was how little I cared about that in the end. Once I stopped expecting the outside world to validate my pain, the need for spectacle disappeared. I didn't need him ruined. I didn't need her shamed. I needed to not lose myself in the aftermath of their choices. As the weeks turned into months, my internal narrative shifted. I stopped asking, "How did this happen?" and started asking, "What do I do with what happened?" That change didn't make things easier, but it made them clearer. It reframed the story from one where I was perpetually reacting to betrayal to one where I was actively deciding who I would be going forward. I noticed how much of my identity had been built around being steady, reliable, low drama. The guy who handled things. The guy who didn't need much. The guy who could absorb discomfort without making it anyone else's problem. That identity had served me well, until it didn't, until it taught the people around me that I would always bend before I broke. Letting go of that version of myself was harder than leaving the house we shared or imagining a future without my wife. It meant admitting that some of my pride had been misplaced, that I'd confused endurance with strength, that I'd believed being chosen once meant I would always be chosen. There were moments I seriously considered reconciliation, not because the pain had faded, but because familiarity is powerful, and grief has a way of masquerading as hope. I pictured us in therapy, unpacking everything, learning new ways to communicate, building something sturdier out of the wreckage. I pictured the relief of not having to explain to the rest of the world why my marriage ended. I pictured the comfort of a known life, even if it was permanently altered. And then I pictured myself, years from now, still carrying the memory of walking into that office and seeing my wife kiss my boss, still feeling the need to brace myself every time she stayed late, every time her phone buzzed, every time work came up in conversation. I imagined the quiet erosion of trust, not dramatic enough to point to, but constant enough to hollow things out over time. That image scared me more than starting over. We had one final long conversation where everything felt painfully honest. No bargaining, no defensiveness, just truth, laid bare in a way that left both of us exposed. She admitted she had taken my presence for granted, that my steadiness had made her feel safe enough to risk losing me. I admitted that I had assumed safety meant permanence, and that assumption had made me blind. We didn't decide anything that night. We didn't need to. The conversation itself was the closure, even if the paperwork and labels hadn't caught up yet. Where I am now is not healed. I don't wake up every day feeling strong or resolved. Some days I still feel like I'm improvising my way through a life I didn't choose, but I also feel more honest than I have in years, more present, less willing to betray myself for the sake of appearances. I no longer frame this experience as something that happened to me. It happened in my life, and I get to decide what it means. I get to decide whether it becomes the story of how I lost everything, or the story of how I finally learned where my limits were. Seeing my wife and my boss kissing was the moment the illusion shattered. Living through what came after has been about learning how to exist without that illusion, without numbing myself, without rushing toward answers just to escape discomfort. It has forced me to sit with uncertainty, to accept that some endings don't come with clarity or justice or clean lines. If there's a resolution here, it's not a reconciliation or a divorce decree or a dramatic turning point. It's quieter than that. It's the understanding that my worth is not defined by my ability to endure betrayal, and my future doesn't depend on preserving a past that no longer exists. I don't know exactly where I'm going from here, but for the first time since all of this began, I know that wherever I end up, I'll be there honestly, without pretending, without shrinking myself to make room for someone else's choices. And that, finally, feels like solid ground.